Hello, my name's Mugs. I'm a hacker and an artist slash curator, and we're currently in the library that I've installed as part of my Vulnerable program of events and an exhibition at Spiral Galleries in London. So in this library, we're going to be learning a little bit about hacker history, and one of the most important drivers for why I've created this Vulnerable show here at Spiral is to emphasize the importance of sound on the hacker history. So when we think about hacker as an aesthetic, we think about green text on black hoodies, sunglasses. And it's not often that we would introduce the notion of sound. But that is a very significant aspect of the origin of hacker culture. In the 1950s, using sound was crucial and, in fact, the only method of hacking at the disposal of young hackers. In particular, there was a hacker whose handle was Joy Bubbles. And Joy Bubbles was born blind. And to entertain himself, he would use his ability for musical perfect pitch and his fascination with whistling to experiment with his home phone. What Joy Bubbles learned is that if he could whistle exactly the frequency of 2600 hertz, which is something like this, that he would be able to get free phone calls. This is the origin of a type of hacking called phreaking, which is spelt with a PH. And it's essential for hackers that need to get connected to one another and communicate with each other, but without incurring any costs. Now, by using that whistle, Joy Bubbles was able to call anywhere in the world for free from his home. It was, of course, illegal, and in America, that crime is called wire fraud. Anything committed over a wire, which is fraudulent. So Joy Bubbles used this talent and shared the information with other hackers. A lot of them in the 50s were also visually impaired and fascinated with sound. And it was their way of communicating with one another by using what were called party lines. So hackers would talk to each other like in a chat room, but by getting free access via their stolen phone call into conference calls where they could talk about hacking and they could communicate with one another. So that was the origin, really, of the classic hacker chat room. But they would be listening to each other rather than reading the text. And as the information was shared, which is typical in the hacker community, we share information with each other openly and build upon each other's research. The electronics engineering students in America started to replicate Joy Bubbles' whistle with synthesizers, essentially, single tone and single oscillator synthesizers, which could produce just one tone, the 2600 hertz tone. The development of these analog synthesizers meant that more and more people were able to gain free phone calls to anywhere in the world. And famously, there's one hacker whose name became Captain Crunch, as we can see here. Captain Crunch, aka John Draper, who is the founder of a magazine called 2600, which is a hacker quarterly, which is sent all over the world. And I have been reading that since I was about 14. Now, Captain Crunch became his handle because John Draper discovered that this whistle that was given away for free as a prize in the serial did exactly 2600 hertz, which meant that anybody could go to a shop, buy a box of Captain Crunch with a whistle in it, and get free phone calls. So, on the one hand, we've got the traditional whistle, Joy Bubbles' perfect pitch inspired ability. Then we've got the whistle available in the cereal box. And then we got the electronics students that were making analog versions. So they were made of simple circuits, but basically the methods were expanding. And it was a DIY sort of endeavor until Steve Wozniak was particularly interested in phreaking and decided to design the first digital blue box, which is this. So this blue box was able to emit the 2600 hertz tone, and then you could dial your number in and you could call anywhere in the world for free. Steve Jobs thought that that was a marvelous invention. Now, Steve Jobs, of course, wasn't technical. He's a marketing man. So on their campus, as they were in college together, they were selling these blue boxes together. So Wozniak's design, Jobs' salesmanship, and together they forged the first product that became the legacy of Apple. And from an ethical perspective, the fact that their first product is something to use to commit wire fraud, I think is worthy of note. So Apple's ethics and the basis of their technology all comes back down to sound. So although we don't by default associate modern consumer technology with sound, there is a lineage that can be traced back. The blossoming of consumer internet-enabled technology as we know it, by virtue of this blue box. And I would like to talk about another corporation who were also very inventive, who didn't survive like Apple did. And that corporation is Sun Microsystems. So I have a particular fondness for Sun Microsystems because when I was a young hacker, which was in the late 1990s, a lot of the systems online were Sun Microsystems, and I had access to a number of Sun Microsystems servers. And consequently, it means that when I see the Sun logo, it has enormous nostalgic benefit to me. And in those days, at the turn of the century, a lot of the internet was running on Sun equipment. So that would include military, the internet infrastructure. Basically everything was made by Sun, both the hardware and the software, similar to the Apple basis. Interestingly, all of Apple's technology is based on an operating system called Unix. Now, Sun is also a type of Unix. So the typical command line aesthetic that you may associate with hacking is usually a Unix-like system. And the Sun Microsystems history is important because one of the founders, Bill Joy, actually wrote what is known as the Internet Protocol. So the code for the Internet was actually written by one of the founders of Sun. And that was an open specification. So I think there's a lot more of the hacker ethos embedded within that because hackers do share things freely. We share information and tools widely with our peers. So I think the fact is that Sun didn't survive because they were everywhere, but they were expensive. They were a commercial Unix, just like Apple, an expensive product, but it was a must-have product for the essential back end of the internet. So all of the data centers that the internet runs on and all of the things which are kept out of sight from us that exist in these huge air-cooled buildings would have been filled with Sun. There are still Sun systems around. I had the enormous pleasure of hacking a very large Sun Microsystems estate last year, and I enjoyed that enormously. But Sun did manage to fail because they were expensive and because they didn't adopt an open source methodology. So there's another operating system called Linux, which is where I began my journey. And I've been using Linux since 1999, or 98 in fact. And it's free, because that's an important part of sharing, is the fact that it's free means that Linux is running on virtually any electronics that you've got that has any kind of ability to compute is very likely to be running on Linux. So Sun were basically overtaken by Linux, but the internet as we know it and also security on the internet are essentially down to the people that created Sun. And they are what I think of as a benevolent corporation. They're not like the tech corporations that we have today. And that's why I've decided to show these adverts from the 90s by Sun, which are fairly ironic, in fact, because the one on the left here is all about evolution and that dinosaurs belong in museums, not in your data center. Unfortunately, Sun Microsystems did become an extinct dinosaur. And monogamy over here is another key one, because they expected everybody to want to keep using Sun and to pay for it. But it didn't quite work out like that. However, the Apple model does seem to have been much more successful. So there is a link there between the hacking aspects. With Sun, there's not necessarily the sound, other than the sound of a data center, which is deafening. But with Steve Wozniak, this was one of his favorite things that he came up with. And the fact that the creation of a synthesizer which was designed to commit crime, which was inspired by a born blind teenager whistling down his phone in the 50s, resulting in essentially modern technology culture as we know it, is something that I think is definitely worth framing. And that's what the Vulnerable exhibition is all about. And there's also a 10,000 word research project to basically contextualize the importance of sound to the hacker culture from the origins. And what I'm aiming to do with Vulnerable is to bring sound back into the fore when we think about hackers. So as part of Vulnerable, we've had musical performances by hackers, and the playlists that hackers create are especially geared towards focus and remaining in your zone. So I'll look forward to hearing some of those. Thank you.